B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, October 11th, 2019. I am pleased to report that we have confirmation from far-flung listeners around the globe that our fixes to the Peter B. Collins podcast machinery were successful. And I want to thank Faith, Olivier in Switzerland, Aiden, and especially Dave, who we talked about yesterday, Dave Polson, who helped us identify the string of code that was jamming everything up. I want to begin today by dedicating this podcast to the memory of Charlie Haddad. Charlie died early yesterday in his sleep at the age of 99 in Detroit. And I've known Charlie for about 30 years. He is my partner Kathy's uncle. He was the only boy in a family of 7. And he was a UAW member who spent his career working at, as they call it in Detroit, Fords. Yes, they think of these as family operations, and Charlie went to work at Ford's, and they put him into the glass shop. And he did his 30 years. He retired in his early 50s, and he spent more time as a Ford's retiree than an active worker. And he used to joke that, yeah, you know, they call me 3 or 4 times a year just to see if I'm still alive, and they've got to send the check. And Charlie used to talk politics with me. I know it was a little hard for him to vote for Obama back in 2008 because of race and because of the legacy of racial tensions in Detroit. But I honor Charlie for a life well lived. And by the way, he worked at Ford's, and he always drove a Cadillac. I'm going to miss you, Charlie. Thanks for some great memories. Today we lead from the impeachment file because someone who'd been pressured by the White House and the State Department not to show up on Capitol Hill today defied the president. And you may have heard of Rudy Giuliani. She was the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, and she's one of those lifetime State Department career diplomats. But she was removed suddenly from her post, and in a prepared statement that was issued before she testified behind closed doors, and it was more of a deposition than testimony, if we're going to be correct about it. Anyway, she said that she was forced to leave Kyiv on the next plane this past spring, and she was removed from her post, with the number 2 dog at the State Department telling her she had done nothing wrong, but the president had lost confidence in her, and the State Department had been under big pressure to remove her since the summer of 2018. Now, this brings Rudy Giuliani directly into the radar screen, and you're going to hear a lot about the so-called America's mayor. He's been a creep for as long as I've been observing him, and his creepy behavior is only getting more outrageous. So Jovanovic denied that she had been partisan. She said she was incredulous that her superiors decided to remove her based on unfounded and false claims by people with clearly questionable motives. She also took direct aim at Giuliani's cronies, whom she said could have been financially threatened by her anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. Contacts of Mr. Giuliani may well have believed that their personal financial ambitions were stymied by our anti-corruption policy in Ukraine. And she's referring to the 2 guys who were picked up as they tried to fly out of the country from Dulles Airport on one-way tickets to Vienna. And that was just on Wednesday night. Also, we have a resignation from the State Department. A career diplomat, Michael McKinley, a senior advisor to Secretary of State Pompeo, resigned this week. We don't have a direct explanation for his move. And so this is a critical, I think, move that does give some momentum to impeachment. Jovanovic has, I think, a bird's-eye seat for the schemes that were being run by Giuliani. And on the one hand, he was designated by Trump, and he says he wasn't representing Trump as a lawyer. just as a representative. And that Trump clearly instructed him to put pressure on the new Ukrainian President Zelensky to try to dig up the so-called dirt on Joe Biden. But at the same time, these two guys with Russian heritage, Fruman and what's the other guy's name? Parnas, I think. I'll get to it. It's in my stack here. They both, at the same time that they were helping Giuliani set up meetings with officials in Ukraine, they were trying to float their own profiteering schemes in Ukraine. And this is a hallmark of the cozy corruption of the Trump administration, where Trump looked the other way as Mike Flynn took $500,000 to lobby for Turkey during the campaign. He turned a blind eye when Mike Flynn kept lobbying for Turkey after he was named National Security Advisor. He let Jared Kushner use his post there at the White House to try to leverage foreign governments to cough up loans for the troubled Kushner real estate empire. And this has been going on and on and on. And so Trump probably knew or suspected that Rudy's buddies were trying to cruise for deals in Ukraine. So we'll get to some of those details in a moment. But Nancy Pelosi, at the very moment I'm speaking to you, which is 2 o'clock Pacific time here on Friday afternoon, is wrapping up a all-Democratic caucus conference call, which we're told is primarily about impeachment. And I hope there are people pressuring her, saying, do not limit the focus to Ukraine. Here in the Washington Post, they recite this talking point from the Democrats. The Ukraine episode is clear-cut, easy for Americans to understand, and doesn't require further proof as the White House has released a rough transcript of the call. But the release of that transcript, the recent comments and moves by Zelensky, he says he wasn't blackmailed or forced, and he has announced some sort of investigation. It may just be for show, but he's announced that there will be an investigation of Biden père fils. And as I've told you from the get-go, I think that relying exclusively on Ukraine is a really bad bet. It's not as simple as it's made out to be. And as I've said, there are clear crimes that are slam dunks. So here's Jim Himes, Democrat of Connecticut. We have a duty to investigate whether the misuse of government resources for personal and political ends goes beyond Ukraine. We have an obligation to see just how deep this sewage flows. And I support that sentiment. Multiple senior Democratic officials tracking the impeachment inquiry say there is no plan to broaden their investigation to include the call on China to investigate the Bidens, or the recent news about Rex Tillerson objecting when Trump and Giuliani asked him, and we'll get to that story in a moment, to intervene and try to set up a prisoner swap with Iran. This article goes on, nor are Democrats readying a new impeachment probe of Trump's request last week that China dig up so-called dirt on Biden. Rather, Democrats are doubling down on their Ukraine probe at lightning speed. And I want to needle the Washington Post because somebody failed to spell lightning properly. They used it as if you're changing the color of something. You know, it's got an E in there, lightening. And the kind of lightning that flashes in the sky doesn't have that E. All right? At any rate, Rick Perry has now received a subpoena from the House investigation committees. He's got some splaining to do about his own efforts to generate profitable deals for his oil patch buddies from Texas. And Parnas and Fruman, the names I was searching for a moment ago, they have been subpoenaed, but they're a little busy because they're locked up by a U.S. attorney. So I'm not sure how quickly we'll be able to hear from those dudes. So there's also a big setback for Trump today as a federal appeals court, and this is working its way up. There's only one more stop for appeals on his battle to keep his tax returns secret. And I'm a little surprised. It's a 2-1 ruling from the D.C. Circuit. That is really the second most powerful court in the country. And they rejected the arguments presented by the president's lawyers of his massive claims of immunity, the fact that there is no investigative purpose, they claim, for Congress to scrutinize his tax returns. And the court just flatly said, no, the law is clear. He's got to cough him up. And so I believe at some point we will see Trump's tax returns. But I think it's going to be a one-day story. We're going to find out he's not as rich as he says, that he cheats on his taxes, and maybe there's stuff in there that will lead to other crimes. But I'm not. I just don't think that this is going to be the thread that is pulled that unravels the I'm going to continue the metaphor here, the invisible cloak that our emperor wears. And the Washington Post also notes that at the appeals court, the Justice Department made a separate filing. So Bill Barr does see himself as Trump's personal lawyer. That becomes very clear these days. So we'll see the Democrats sort this out. But they do have a lot of new fodder to work with, and it comes from crazy Rudy Giuliani. And it's amazing. You know, Trump likes to have an obsequious lawyer like Michael Cohen or Rudy Giuliani who he can bark at and conspire with, and he imagines that nothing bad will happen. But Rudy Giuliani is such a scumbag, and I guess the two of them deserve each other. But as I mentioned, Parnas and Fruman, who were helping him set up meetings with Ukrainian officials to look for that information about 2016. And yes, Ukraine did cough up the black ledger book that led to the indictment and conviction of Paul Manafort. And there was some collusion with the Clinton campaign on that. Will Trump be able to find actual evidence that persuades Americans? I don't know. But these buddies of Rudy's, who, are now under arrest on campaign finance violations, well, it appears that Jovanovic, the ambassador, knew that Parnas and Fruman were trying to get involved in the lucrative gas business in Ukraine. Parnas had pitched a deal to the chief executive of Naftogaz. And apparently she was not playing ball, according to the Trump playbook. Then we've got Pete Sessions. No relation, as far as I know, to Jefferson Beauregard Sessions of Alabama. But Pete Sessions is taking a break from Congress, where he lost his re-election campaign last year, and he's trying to resuscitate and get back into the House. But he is caught up in this because he accepted contributions from Parnas and Fruman, and he is listed in their indictment as Congressman 1. And it appears that he knows that he got money from these guys, and then he did their bidding. He turned around and wrote a letter urging Mike Pompeo to remove Marie Yovanovitch as the ambassador to Ukraine. Is that a quid pro and quo, Mr. Sessions? Well, it smells like it from here. Then we got Rexon Tillerson, who is turning into a fair-haired... he's always had fair hair, and as a bald guy, I'm slightly jealous. But, we know that Trump picked him because he thought he looked good on TV. And so Rexon Tillerson has been outed for an incident that occurred in 2017, where he went, as requested, to a meeting in the Oval Office, and he didn't know that Rudy Giuliani and former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, who, like Giuliani, was a U.S. attorney in New York. George W. Bush made him the Attorney General during the final year of his second term. And Mukasey is just a low-life shark. He's a right-wing apologist who will defend anything a Republican does. He is extremely partisan. So at this meeting, Rex Tillerson apparently was so appalled that they pressed him to try to persuade the Justice Department to give up their prosecution of an Iranian-Turkish gold trader named Reza Zarrab. Zarrab was a client of Rudy Giuliani's, and Rudy says he only took him on as a client so he could trade him to Iran for the release of an American pastor who has been repatriated. I can't think of the guy's name, but this was a scheme to make Giuliani happy. I don't know what Mukasey got out of the deal, but the trade never took place. And Rex Tillerson left that meeting and immediately encountered then White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, and he very clearly expressed his opposition to this kind of scheming, which he had told Giuliani, Mukasey, and Trump was illegal. And get this, I don't believe Tillerson's a lawyer, but Giuliani and Mukasey are. Good sentiment in a piece by Aaron Blake of the Washington Post today. And what he describes is what I call the casual corruption in the White House. I referred to it a moment ago. How everybody's got a scheme going on. Everybody does it. And nobody objects. Blake notes that political appointees overrode the career officials to put a freeze on that military aid to Ukraine. There also are the recent events cited to Rex Tillerson that I just recounted. And then there is the testimony of Jovanovic, which certainly will be prodigiously leaked in the next few days. And when you hear Trump talk about how he's just really, focused on corruption, and he's going to end corruption in Ukraine, and he's sitting in a self-constructed swamp of corruption, it's got his name on it in gold letters. And he hosts these mob rallies like he did in Minneapolis last night. He went right into the district of Ilhan Omar. They put a picture of her in her headscarf up on the Jumbotron. And then Trump pandered to the racist elements in his mob, denounced her as a socialist, America hater, and he attacked the Somali immigrant community, which by all accounts is a real asset to Minneapolis and St. Paul. He promised rally attendees that he would give local communities a greater say in refugee policy and put in place enhanced vetting and responsible immigration controls. Quote, as you know, for many years, leaders in Washington brought large numbers of refugees to your state from Somalia without considering the impact on schools and communities and taxpayers. You should be able to decide what is best for your own cities and your own neighborhoods, and that's why you have the right to do now. And believe me, no other president would be doing that. He's openly pandering to racist sentiments. And there were some protesters in the mob rally. We're told that 52,000 Somalis in the state. I don't have a count on the crowd size. I'm sure Trump will tell you that it was filled to the gills and there were 1 million people stacked up outside. So this is predictable, but it shows how low he is willing to go. And after he got finished smearing Ilhan Omar, he had some choice comments for Joe Biden. He repeated his claims that Hunter Biden secured a $1.5 billion investment fund in China. There is no evidence for that, by the way, and I'm no apologist for Joe or Hunter Biden. The Ukraine issues, I believe, do deserve honest investigation. We're not going to get it from Trump and his crew. But Trump went after the son of the vice president and presidential candidate. Hunter, you know nothing about energy. You know nothing about China. You know nothing about anything, frankly. Hunter, you're a loser. Yeah, I think that's actually correct. As much as I am loath to credit Trump with anything. He's going to do this again tonight in St. Charles, Louisiana. And you can bet it's going to be a barn burner and a roof raiser. So this comment I'll quote. Biden was never considered smart, Trump said. He was never considered a good senator. He was only a good vice president because he figured out how to kiss Barack Obama's ass. What does Mike Pence do all day long? I mean, he doesn't just kiss that ass. He's pretty far up inside it. So that's the latest ranting and raving from Trump. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I thank you for any patience that you have exercised this week during my problems with the RSS feed and delivering the podcast to iTunes and outlets like that. And as I mentioned at the top, I believe we got it fixed. Got my fingers crossed. But I thank you for your patience and continued support. And let's identify some of the people who support my podcast, like Jason Spitzer, Janet Price, Terry Paris, and Brian Massey. They all contribute $5, $10 a month, in some cases a $50 annual subscription like Janet. And Jason just decided to tack on a few extra bucks as a bonus when he renewed his annual subscription by mail recently. So I appreciate the community here and the generous support that many people provide. And this is my low-key way of reminding you that if you're not a supporter, you can fix that right now. Visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and it's easy to make a few choices there. And should you choose not to use PayPal, just address your correspondence to my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, it's been announced today by the Pentagon that we are going to deploy an additional 1,800 U.S. soldiers to Saudi Arabia, along with some Patriot missile batteries, an Air Expeditionary Wing Headquarters unit, and a THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. We have no treaties with Saudi Arabia that require us to do this. And, as I saw a person point out on Twitter, let us recall that during the Clinton years, Osama bin Laden was so offended that U.S. troops were positioned and deployed on what he considered to be the holy soil of Saudi Arabia that he declared war on the United States. And whether you believe the official story of 9/11 or not, bin Laden did lead a jihad that seduced the United States into invading Iraq, Afghanistan, the lengthy occupation. And all of that traces back to the positioning of U.S. troops on Saudi soil. They blew up the Khobar Towers, residence for soldiers. But, you know, these things don't matter to Trump because he's got a hand-holding relationship with MBS, the bloodthirsty crown prince there in the Saudi kingdom. And the idea that U.S. troops should defend this autocratic regime run by a royal family and implicitly support their elective war in Yemen, this is what flies in the face of Trump's instincts regarding Syria. So let's air out Syria a little bit. We have details that about 50 Islamic State so-called high-value prisoners will be transferred from Syria to Iraq. Now, I don't know if they're going to put them in Abu Ghraib or exactly how that will be handled, but it does dodge an issue for the United States. I'm glad they're not attempting to send them to Guantanamo and start a whole new round of the Gulag mess. But I want to single out the New York Times today for its yellow journalism. They are trying to shame a man who clearly has no shame and cannot be shamed. And they're spilling just oodles of ink, trying to point out how dangerous it is for Trump to have announced that he's pulling the remaining 1,000 U.S. troops out of Syria. And if you're a regular listener, you know I think this is long overdue. And while Trump is ham-handed in the way he does it, and I don't support the failure to notify allies or even to consult with his own commanders. But if you remember, he tried this back before Christmas, and then all of the adults in the room, including General Kelly, forced him to walk it back. And I hear so many people buy into this bullshit that 150 American soldiers were keeping the peace between the Kurds and the Turks, and that Trump essentially green-lighted the slaughter of the Turks by removing our troops. Well, I'm sorry, 150 Americans were just cannon fodder. They were targets. So here's the New York Times. They first trot out a general to try to embarrass Trump. The international crisis that many of his opponents feared for so long has finally arrived, but it's of Trump's own making. Pits him against his own party and his own government. And here is General John G. Stavridis. He's a retired admiral, former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. When we walk away from loyal allies, as we did in Vietnam and we're now threatening to do in Afghanistan and Syria, the wheels come off. Then General Vodal, the recently passed chair of the Joint Chiefs, he said that Turkish attacks on the Kurdish fighters, coupled with a hasty U.S. departure, now threaten to rapidly destabilize an already fragile security situation in Syria's northeast. So we're supposed to be afraid, very, very afraid. But that's not all. The New York Times even embraces right-wing Christians, the evangelicals, because Franklin Graham has called on Trump to reconsider his decision. Pat Robertson says he's appalled. But that guy Robert Jeffress, who recently put out a tweet that Trump retweeted that got him into trouble, he said, well, some evangelicals may disagree with the president's decision, but I guarantee you there's not one evangelical supporter of the president who would switch their vote to Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden over a Syria decision. But let me ask you to read a piece that I've linked to in today's show file, written by Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector who was a guest in an interview podcast here recently. And Ritter knows the Kurds. His father was serving in Turkey in the 1970s. And Scott got to know different flavors of Kurds, pardon that expression, but there are different strains of Kurdish ethnicity and political alliance. But Scott Ritter went hunting with so-called mountain Turks. And so I think compared to most of us, he has grounding on these issues that give him an advantage. And he said that deciphering the alphabet soup of these Turkish-Kurdish groups goes a long way towards explaining why the Turkish actions are justified and why Trump will ultimately be vindicated for pulling the troops out. And his summation is Trump's decision to withdraw American forces from the Syrian border zone makes perfect sense. It avoids a damaging conflict with Turkey, a strategic NATO ally, and sidesteps a potential major power confrontation with Russia. This was always in the cards, since the United States was never a guarantor of the Syrian Kurds' objective of autonomy. But the precipitous way that the American redeployment was announced and the fact it was done void of any coordination with either the Kurds or other U.S. regional allies sets the stage for more geopolitical chaos in a region already racked by conflict. And I want to thank Carl Howard for tipping me off to this piece at the World Socialist website, because they noticed that Trump has been denounced for many of his tweets. I've been one of the people issuing denunciations. But one tweet that he made this week has not been played up by the corporate media. Quoting, The United States has spent $8 trillion, all caps, fighting and policing in the Middle East. Thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. Millions of people have died on the other side. All caps in the rest here. Going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made in the history of our country. Back to regular type. We went to war under a false and now disproven premise. All caps. Weapons of mass destruction. Now, he's a raving lunatic and an asshole. But this happens to be true. And this is the instinct that is in tension with the move to deploy another 1,800 soldiers to Saudi Arabia. And it makes you wonder, what days is Trump actually in charge? It appears last Sunday he was in charge because there wasn't anybody around to stop him. But 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, he seems to be on a different leash. You've heard of Jeremy Hammond. He's already serving a stretch in prison for a previous conviction. And they brought him to the Eastern District of Virginia, put him before the Assange grand jury, and as expected, he refused to testify. So now he joins Chelsea Manning, jailed for contempt. And this is really, really wrong. Now, we don't have any elected officials in recent weeks speaking up for Chelsea Manning. Nobody's going to speak up for Jeremy Hammond. This is an abuse, clear and simple. And it continues day after day. Over at The Intercept, Alex Emmons has confirmed that this guy Henry Fries, who is locked up and accused of sharing intelligence on China with two reporters, one from CNBC, Amanda Messias, the other Courtney Kuby from NBC. We don't know which one was living with Henry Fries, but one of them was, and the other profited from that relationship. And Henry Fries will be tried under the Espionage Act, which allows no explanation for motivation about these kinds of leaks. I didn't get to see it last night because I was screening another documentary at the Mill Valley Film Festival, but there was on CNN a town hall event featuring many of the Democratic presidential candidates, and it was all focused on LGBTQ issues. And all the Democrats agree on this, so to me this was not a very important event. But Elizabeth Warren got off a zinger. She was asked how she deals with people who say that marriage is between a man and a woman, and she said, well, that's probably coming from a man. And I would tell that man, you should only marry one woman if you can find her. And Joe Biden, he was trying to show how woke he is. And, on gay issues, it's fair to say that Joe Biden forced Obama's hand. He evolved just a few hours, maybe a few days faster than Obama, a few months, maybe a year or two ahead of Hillary Clinton. But they do try to rewrite history as they pretend that all along, I've supported all of the rights of these groups. And Chris Cuomo, the CNN moderator, has had to issue an apology. When Kamala Harris, the California senator, was introduced, she said, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And Cuomo said, oh, mine too. And I have to say that I share his discomfort with this rote requirement that we all announce our pronouns. I respect that if somebody wants to be called them or it, I'll acknowledge its request. But that we all have to recite our pronouns every time we appear? I don't buy that. Here in Northern California, the power is being restored to more than 1 million residents who had it cut off in the last 3 days. And the new president of Pacific Gas and Electric issued a partial apology yesterday. His name's Bill Johnson. He was recruited from the Tennessee Valley Authority, and his focus is safety. Now, his other focus is he inherited a bankrupt organization that is being hammered by the bankruptcy court judge over its failure to provide for safety in its operations. And I want to recommend a piece by Lee Fung that is published at The Intercept today. disclosing how PG&E has spent billions of dollars paying dividends to its shareholders and paying lobbyists and PR firms to try to repair its image as a reckless, criminally convicted corporation. And we know that in the past, this goes back 10 years, but PG&E executives who were tasked with the project every year of trimming trees to prevent power lines from setting them on fire, many of those executives were paid bonuses for cutting the budget, not for trimming trees. And in Southern California, a serious wildfire is out of control in the San Fernando Valley. My old radio DJ pal, Mimi Chen, had to evacuate her home last night. This is the Saddle Ridge Fire. 100,000 people have been ordered evacuated. This is north of L.A., in the valley. They don't know the cause of the fire. The power was off at the time it began, at least I believe so. And last year, of course, in Southern California, the Woolsey Fire ravaged 100,000 acres north of L.A., and that was started at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. We've never had a good investigation of the cause of that fire and the extent to which nuclear waste or residual jet fuel from Santa Susana floated into the atmosphere over the Los Angeles basin. And I give Governor Newsom credit. He's dancing on a tightrope. But he came out yesterday with blistering comments about PG&E, that this power shutoff may have been necessary for safety, but that it's a legacy of greed and a failure to address safety issues that are chronic. At Brownsville, Texas, a couple of days ago, immigrants came in from the Matamoros, Mexico side, and they blocked the bridge, the Gateway International Bridge, for 15 hours to express their frustration with being trapped in Mexico while they await a hearing or decision on their request for asylum status. Report from Hong Kong that of the 2,400 people who've been arrested over the last 4 months for protesting, almost a third of them are under the age of 18. That's a fascinating little factoid. We're continuing to monitor the situation in Ecuador, where the protesters who object to Lenin Moreno, their president's dance with the International Monetary Fund and the imposition of austerity measures at the first of the month. Well, yesterday they occupied the National Assembly building in Quito after tearing down the security gates in front of it. And finally today, Shepard Smith, Shep, is jumping the good ship Fox News. He was one of the original hires back in 1996 when Murdoch and Roger Ailes put the right-wing network on the air. And he left abruptly. He said, recently I asked the company to allow me to leave. Like he'd be shot if he tried without permission. After requesting that I stay, they obliged. And because of a non-compete agreement that's part of his exit, he won't be joining another network anytime soon. Thanks for joining me today for my news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.